Let's now take this conversation further by chatting to someone who knows all about sport activism. Tonight, we are chatting to Lord Peter Hain, who is a co-author of the groundbreaking book, Pitch Battles, about sport, racism and resistance. Good evening, sir, and welcome to Sport on Full View.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So a year later, after we have spoken about these uncomfortable conversations, would you say that we are making a positive step in the right direction as the global community?
Well, compared with what it was, yes. If you take, for example, prominent global sports stars like Raheem Sterling of Manchester City, speaking out on racism, supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that arose from the terrible murder of George Floyd a year ago, or Lewis Hamilton, the biggest global star in Formula One and in many other sports as well, doing the same when neither of them had felt a few years ago able to do so. Mm-hmm. And yet the issues were the same. And as black sports stars themselves, they felt it in their bones. That is progress. And certainly compared with the treatment of the American sports star Colin Kaepernick, who took the knee in protest against President Trump's racism and other associated issues, or going back to the 1968 Olympics when Tommy Smith and John Carlos, the Black American athletes who were on the medal-winning podium, they raised their fists in a Black Power salute and were sacked, and their families suffered terribly. So there is progress compared with those yardsticks. Yes, seriously important progress, but there's still a very long way to go.
Absolutely. And you've just mentioned Lewis Hamilton and the stance that he took. I mean, it even led to his employers, Daimler, thinking about changing the silver livery to black. What more can be done?
Well, in Formula One, Lewis Hamilton's led a drive to create greater diversity. He's the only black Formula One driver, and there's nobody else really coming up through the ranks who joined the Formula One squad. It's all white with the exception of him. And the Mercedes team, to their AMG team, to their credit, they repainted the car black as he'd asked them to do. They've gone right behind him. Again, that is progress, because very often in the past, sports officials would have clamped down upon them, would have either isolated sports people like Lewis Hamilton and Raheem Sterling. So at least they've been jogged into action. But there is a long way to go, as I say. Formula One, a sport that I follow avidly and am a fan of, is pretty well all white. And in football, you don't see the Premier League, which is followed all out over South Africa by soccer fans, as I know. You don't see the same level of proportionately of black footballers in the British Premier League expressed in coaching and managing and on the boards of the clubs and leading the clubs. So that has to change as well. But I think sport has been going through, on a global level, much more change, accelerated change in the last couple of years on gender as well.
Yeah.
Women sports stars are now rising in prominence. I mean, the American soccer captain, Megan Rapinoe, very outspoken, and yet she's a global superstar. And she would not have been able to be as outspoken certainly 10 years ago. And the rise of women's football, the women's Super League in Britain, is getting prominence on television that it never got a year ago, let alone in past years.
Absolutely. And you know, just to stick with Formula One for a bit there, I mean, Lewis Hamilton even went to the extent of now calling it the Billionaire Boys Club, you know, talking about the economic divide and that if it were a couple of years ago, he probably wouldn't even be in the sport. He's even said that it'll take maybe another decade for us to have another black driver in Formula One. So how can black people find their spaces in the sport, be it as, you know, mechanics or engineers?
Well, I hope young black people in South Africa, in Britain, and elsewhere in the world will see the opportunities under Lewis Hamilton's leadership that they can take, because there are all sorts of opportunities in Formula One. It is high performance engineering at the very, very top.
Yeah.
And what is very exciting about it is a lot of the technology, for example, on safety. I mean, those cars can crash at 200 kilometers an hour straight into a wall, and the drivers walk away alive and can drive the next day. And that technology is going into road cars. And so people of all races, but particularly given it's largely a white sport, young black youngsters, men and women, girls and boys, could see all sorts of opportunities to be young engineers, to be maybe karting drivers and drivers themselves. The barrier, of course, to becoming a Formula One star, as Lewis Hamilton himself has said, he's from a very poor background.
Yeah.
His father had to do 2 or 3 jobs to get him into this position.
And, you know, Lord Peter Hain, I also wanted to talk about the importance of holding those in power accountable. You know a thing or two about this because you've also put yourself in harm's way. How do we effectively go about doing this?
Well, it depends on everybody's situation. Yes, when I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the late 60s and 1970s, I was sent a letter bomb by the apartheid police, which fortunately didn't explode in the way that it did, killing other anti-apartheid activists across the world. And there have been consequences for me, but you've got to stand up for what you believe and keep fighting and keep campaigning. And there are lots of hugely talented young black youngsters in South Africa and right across the world have so much to contribute, and they've got to be supported, but they've also got to fight for what they believe and not accept the rebuffs, because as you've seen, the Lewis Hamiltons and the Raheem Sterlings, they are now standing tall.
Absolutely. And just in terms of taking the knee, you know, the importance of that, especially when we look at football and, you know, how deeply racially divided it is, the importance of doing that. I mean, even in South Africa, when it came to cricket, that was a huge debate over whether that should happen or not.
Well, I've been very impressed with the way the Premier League has led the way with taking the knee at the start of every match this past year, and the same with Formula One grid under Lewis Hamilton's leadership. But I was very disappointed that of all countries, and in cricket of all sports, there was no unity on taking the knee. South Africa, in its racist cricket and sporting history, been the first to take the knee and give a signal to the whole of the country where they stood personally and where South compared with the old apartheid one. So I was very disappointed, and I think there's a lot of change still needed in South African cricket. I know it's been through a period of turmoil and attempts to get new leadership in, and that's welcome. But there's a long way to go there and in other sports as well. And the failure to take the knee, for me, seeing it taken in the British Premier League and on the Formula One grid was very, very disappointing and hard to understand.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for unpacking this very serious topic with us. That is, of course, Lord Peter Hain, who is the co-author of the groundbreaking book, Pitch Battles. That's where we'll wrap it up for now from the Sports